friends, and welcome to another update of real-time editing of issue descriptions. This week, I want to give you a short update on how the awareness widget is doing. It has officially moved into the review process. So as you can see on my screen, all the good chess here on the top is going to be added to the issue sidebar. So the empty state currently is a share to collaborate link. If you click on it, it gets automatically added to your clipboard. On this MR, you can see all the potential states like single collaborator, when you hover over the collaborator, what the current state is, two collaborators, etc., etc. So includes all the active states, includes all, if there's any overflow of users, like more than 4 users are kind of like put into the more collaborators placeholder. You get a pop over. Inactive states are also there. Hopefully the last week before this ships took quite a while to get there. Another thing I want to show you is like how the Ruby Rust binding is actually working. As some of you know, we're relying on a library that is written in Rust called YCRDT or wires. And this is a CRDT implementation that is quite popular because it's based off of one of the most popular JavaScript libraries used in that space, named YGS. And what we are doing in order to bring CRDTs to GitLab, which is a Ruby application, is we need to provide a Ruby version or a Ruby binding for those CRDTs. And so this is why we ended up like building this YRubyGem, and this YRubyGem is nothing else than a thin wrapper around the Rust library. But the actual implementation of the gem is quite interesting because there's a couple of ways to do that, and Ruby is somewhat known to deal with native extensions a lot. Like even when you install or when you create a new Rails application from scratch, you have to install a couple of native extensions, but most of them are written in C and not in Rust. Rust is it's not a completely new language, but it's a relatively new language used for Ruby native extensions. And those native extensions can be written in several ways. Like you could expose Rust functions directly via the C foreign function interface. Like this is supported, but it's not super comfortable. And I want to show like how we are doing it and what we are using for it. So this is the YRuby repository, and the YRuby repository is not terribly complex. It's basically like two source folder. We have the lib folder, which is your regular Ruby gem structure. It's not super exciting, it's just a few Ruby files. And we have this nice little extension folder here, and it contains all the native extensions that are built in Rust. We have a single one, it's the YRuby native extension. And this particular structure is set up by a library called Magnus. And Magnus is a high-level framework or library that allows us to write Ruby to Rust bindings in a relatively convenient way. There is already a YRubyGem published, which isn't using Magnus. It's actually relying on Ruti, which is another great tool to write this kind of gems. But Magnus has a few features that I really like, and I want to show you what exactly I mean by that. So let's just take a look at the array class here, which is, you're kind of like familiar with an array in Ruby, I assume, and you can, get a specific item at a specific index. You can insert an item at a specific index. You can iterate over an array, and all those operations somehow need to be supported by the CRDT version of an array as well. And we want to make it as easy as possible for Ruby developers to interact with a CRDT, so there should not be any inconveniences or unfamiliar concepts. And this is the primary goal of the Ruby wrapper. It should make CRDTs accessible for Ruby developers. So what we see here is that the insert, like when we're inserting at a specific index, we actually call a YArray insert method, or function. But this method doesn't really exist here because it exists in Rust, and it's just a binding between the Ruby and the Rust library. And if we go to the Rust code here, we can see this y-array insert method and how it is structured. And this is kind of interesting because we can see the index here is an unsigned integer. And this is not really, there's a lot of matching in order to make this work. So Magnus automatically converts that for us. We expect the index to be a number, in particular integer. And therefore we can assume that the index here is of the correct type. And if it's not of the correct type, Magnus will make sure that it raises an error and automatically for you, type error in this case. But there's also this magic value here, which is a Ruby value, which can be literally any valid Ruby value because you can, technically insert anything into an array. And yeah, this was a short journey or a short intro into how Ruby and Rust bindings are done. I hope you've somewhat liked the additional technical detail. And yeah, see you soon.